My sister's husband made creepy advances for months, got into my bed saying we had a connection, and claimed I was seducing him. I made him confess in front of everyone. My sister Rachel got married to Brett in March, and I was honestly so happy for her. She'd been single for years after her ex cheated, and Brett seemed like this perfect guy who treated her like a queen. He had a good job at a bank, always brought her flowers, and made her laugh constantly. At the wedding, he even cried during his vows, which made everyone cry too. I thought my sister finally found someone worthy of her. The first few months were fine. Brett would come to family dinners and game nights, and everything felt normal. Then around July, he started acting different toward me. At first, it was just weird comments like saying my dress looked nice when I was wearing sweatpants or calling me kiddo even though I'm 23. I figured he was just trying to be a friendly brother-in-law. But then it got weirder. He'd find reasons to touch my shoulder when he walked by or play with my hair when Rachel wasn't looking. He started texting me memes at midnight and calling me beautiful in the family group chat, but making it seem like a joke. When I'd post anything on Instagram, he'd immediately like it and comment fire emojis. Rachel thought it was sweet that her husband was trying to bond with her little sister. By September, it was getting uncomfortable. He'd show up when he knew Rachel was at work, but I was home from college. He'd make comments about how I must have tons of boyfriends, or how some guy was going to be real lucky. When I'd try to leave the room, he'd follow me asking why I was avoiding him. One time, he said my pajama shorts were inappropriate when I came down for water at night. I started staying in my room whenever he visited. Then last month, Brett and Rachel had to move in with us because their apartment had water damage from the upstairs neighbor's burst pipe. Suddenly, he was in my space all the time. He'd knock on my bedroom door at random times asking to borrow phone chargers he didn't need. He'd sit next to me on the couch and put his arm around me while Rachel was in the kitchen. When I'd move away, he'd say I was being cold, and family should be comfortable together. He started making these gross jokes about college girls and asking if I had experience with older guys. I kept telling him to stop, but he'd laugh and say I couldn't take a joke. Last Tuesday night was when everything changed. Rachel was at her night shift at the hospital, and my parents were at their weekly bowling league. I was in my room doing homework when Brett walked in without knocking and literally got into my bed. He tried to put his arm around me saying he was lonely and just wanted to talk. I shoved him hard and told him to get out immediately. He said Rachel didn't understand him like I did and we had a connection. I said the only connection we had was that he married my sister, and he needed to leave right now. He finally left but said I was being dramatic and he was just being friendly. That's when I knew I had to do something, but I couldn't figure out what. If I told Rachel, she'd be destroyed. If I told my parents, my dad would probably kill Brett. I needed proof that wouldn't destroy my family but would get him away from me. So I came up with a plan. I started leaving my phone recording in my pocket whenever he was around. I got him saying nasty stuff about my body, asking if I thought about him, saying Rachel was getting boring. But I needed more. I needed him to admit it clearly. Friday night, we had a family dinner for my mom's birthday. Everyone was there, including my Aunt Linda and Uncle Rob and my cousins. Rachel made this beautiful dinner and everyone was happy. After cake, Brett had been drinking beer all night and was getting bold. He kept winking at me across the table. When Rachel went to get dessert plates, he loudly said I looked gorgeous tonight and reached for my hand. That's when I stood up and said I had something to share. I said Brett had been making me really uncomfortable lately, and I wanted to address it with everyone present so there were witnesses. Brett laughed and said I was misunderstanding his friendliness. So I asked him directly why he got into my bed on Tuesday. The table went quiet. Rachel dropped a plate. Brett said I was lying and trying to cause drama. I pulled out my phone and played a recording of him saying Rachel didn't understand him like I did. Then another of him asking if I ever thought about older men. Then another of him describing what he wanted to do to me. Rachel started sobbing. My dad stood up so fast his chair fell over. My mom grabbed Rachel and held her. Brett started stammering that it was taken out of context, that I was seducing him, that I was jealous of Rachel. My Uncle Rob, who's a cop, told Brett to shut up and get out before things got worse. Brett looked at Rachel begging her to believe him, but she just stared at him in disgust. Brett opened his mouth to argue with Uncle Rob, but my dad moved between them so fast I barely saw him stand up. Dad's face was red and his hands were shaking as he pointed at Brett and said he had exactly 5 minutes to pack a bag and get out of this house. Brett started to say something, but Dad cut him off and told him not to say another word unless he wanted things to get much worse. Mom was still holding Rachel, who couldn't stop crying, her whole body shaking against Mom's shoulder. I was trembling too, but it was different now. Like all the fear and tension from the past months was finally leaving my body. Everyone knew the truth and I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Brett went upstairs and Uncle Rob followed right behind him, not saying anything but making it clear he wasn't letting Brett out of his sight. I pulled my phone back out and showed my parents more of the recordings I had saved. There was one from 2 weeks ago where Brett described what he wanted to do to me in gross detail, and another where he said Rachel was getting boring in bed and he needed someone younger. Rachel heard that one and ran to the bathroom and we could hear her throwing up. Mom went after her while Dad stood there listening to the rest of the recordings with his jaw clenched, so tight I thought his teeth might break. Uncle Rob came back downstairs about 10 minutes later with Brett carrying a duffel bag. Brett's eyes were red and he kept looking at Rachel, who was back from the bathroom but wouldn't even glance in his direction. Uncle Rob put his hand on Brett's shoulder and steered him toward the door, telling him to get in his car and leave. Brett tried one more time to talk to Rachel, saying her name in this pathetic voice, but she just turned away and buried her face in Mom's shoulder again. Uncle Rob walked Brett all the way to his car and stood there watching until Brett drove away. The house was completely silent for a few minutes after they left. Nobody knew what to say or do. Then suddenly everyone started talking at once, asking me if I was okay, and when this started, and why I didn't tell them sooner. Aunt Linda came over and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, telling me she was so proud of me for speaking up, and that took real courage. My cousins looked sick, like they couldn't believe this had been happening at family dinners and game nights while they were right there. One of them said she remembered Brett being weird with me at the 4th of July barbecue, but she thought she was imagining it. Rachel asked if she could hear all the recordings, even though I could tell it was killing her to ask. We went up to my room and sat on my bed while I played them in order starting from the first one I got in late September. She cried through every single one, sometimes having to pause because she was crying too hard to breathe. After each recording, she would apologize, saying she should have seen it and she should have protected me and she was so sorry. I kept telling her it wasn't her fault, that Brett was good at hiding what he was really like, but she just kept apologizing. That night, Rachel couldn't go into the guest room where Brett's stuff still was. She asked if she could sleep in my room and I said of course. We stayed up talking until 3 in the morning with her asking questions about every single thing Brett had done. When did he first start acting weird? What exactly did he say? Did he ever touch me? How did I feel during all of it? I told her everything, every uncomfortable comment, and every time he followed me around the house and every gross text message. It was painful to go through it all, but it also felt good to finally tell someone everything, without being scared it would destroy her marriage. The next morning, Dad and Uncle Rob started packing up all of Brett's stuff from the guest room. They filled garbage bags with his clothes and boxed up his other things, working quickly like they wanted every trace of him gone as fast as possible. Uncle Rob called a locksmith who came that afternoon and changed all the locks on our doors. While we were waiting for the locksmith, Uncle Rob told me he was going to file an official report about Brett's behavior at the police station. He said Rachel called her supervisor at the hospital and said she needed to take a few days off for a family emergency. Her supervisor must have heard something in her voice because she didn't ask any questions, just told Rachel to take all the time she needed. Mom called her work too and said she was taking personal time. For the next few days, Mom made sure Rachel and I ate actual meals and checked on us constantly, bringing us tea and sitting with us when we needed to talk. Brett started texting Rachel on Sunday morning. The first message said he was sorry and he was drunk and I misunderstood everything. Rachel showed me her phone and we read through his excuses together. He sent another text an hour later saying I had been flirting with him and leading him on. Then another saying Rachel must know deep down that he would never actually do anything wrong. Uncle Rob came over that afternoon and Rachel showed him all the texts. He said this was good actually, that it showed Brett's pattern of trying to manipulate the situation and blame me instead of taking responsibility. He told Rachel to keep her phone and document every single message Brett sent. 3 days after the birthday dinner, Rachel had an appointment with Benjamin Carlson, a divorce attorney that Aunt Linda recommended. I went with her for support, and we sat in his office while Rachel played some of the recordings. Benjamin listened carefully and took notes, nodding as the recordings played. When they finished, he said Rachel had really strong grounds for divorce based on emotional abuse and inappropriate conduct toward a family member. He explained the process would take a few months, but with this evidence, it should be straightforward. Rachel signed the paperwork to start the divorce that same day. The next morning, Rachel and I went to the courthouse to file for a restraining order against Brett. The building was big and confusing with lots of hallways and offices. We found the right clerk's window and she gave us forms to fill out. Rachel had to write down specific incidents and dates, and I helped her remember everything. The clerk looked at our evidence, including the recordings and the texts Brett had sent. She was really kind and explained that the recordings showed clear harassment and unwanted advances, which was exactly what restraining orders were designed to protect against. She said a judge would review everything and we would get a hearing date within 2 weeks. The judge's office called 2 days later to schedule Rachel's restraining order hearing for the following week. The clerk explained we'd need to bring all the evidence and be prepared to testify about specific incidents. Rachel's hands shook while she wrote down the date and time on our kitchen calendar. That same afternoon, Brett's mom called our house phone and Mom answered in the living room while Rachel and I were upstairs. We could hear Mom's voice getting louder and firmer as the conversation went on. When she hung up, she came upstairs and sat on my bed looking tired and angry at the same time. She told us Brett's parents wanted to arrange family counseling sessions where everyone could talk things through and work toward forgiveness. Mom said she told them absolutely not, that Brett's behavior was predatory and dangerous, and there would be no working things out or second chances. She said they tried to claim Brett was just being friendly, and I must have misunderstood his intentions. Mom told them she'd heard the recordings herself and knew exactly what their son had done. They hung up on her after that. Rachel started crying again, and Mom held both of us, saying she was proud we were standing up for ourselves, and she'd protect us no matter what Brett's family said. The following Monday, I went back to my college classes for the first time since the birthday dinner. Walking through campus felt weird because everything looked normal, but I felt completely different inside. I sat in my psychology lecture but couldn't focus on anything the professor was saying. My mind kept replaying the moment I stood up at dinner and announced what Brett had done. I kept seeing Rachel's face when she dropped that plate. During my English class, I realized the professor had called on me twice and I hadn't heard her either time. She gave me a concerned look and moved on to another student. After class, she asked if everything was okay, and I just nodded and left quickly before she could ask more questions. I wasn't ready to explain to anyone what had happened. My friends texted asking where I'd been and why I seemed so distracted, but I told them I had family stuff going on and would explain later. I went through the motions of attending classes and taking notes, but nothing stuck in my brain. On Wednesday afternoon, a process server showed up at our house with legal papers for Rachel. She signed for them with shaking hands, and we opened the envelope together at the kitchen table. Brett's attorney had filed a response to the restraining order request claiming the whole situation was a misunderstanding. The paper said I had been flirting with Brett for months and making advances toward him. They claimed I was jealous of Rachel's marriage and trying to break them up. They said the recordings were edited or taken out of context. Rachel called Benjamin immediately, and he told her to bring the papers to his office that afternoon. We drove there together, and Benjamin read through everything carefully. He said this was a common defense strategy where the accused tries to flip the narrative and blame the victim. He pulled out the full recordings from my phone along with timestamps showing they were unedited. He said he'd file an immediate response and request an emergency hearing given the seriousness of the allegations and the evidence we had. He explained that judges take restraining orders seriously when there's clear proof of harassment and inappropriate behavior. 2 days later, Benjamin called to say the judge had reviewed the evidence and granted Rachel a temporary restraining order that would stay in effect until the full hearing. Brett had to stay at least 500 feet away from Rachel, me, and our family home. Rachel cried with relief when she heard that. Uncle Rob filed his official police report that same week, and a few days later a detective called our house asking to speak with me. His name was Miguel Rasmussen, and he said he specialized in harassment and stalking cases. We set up an appointment for the next afternoon at the police station. Mom came with me for support, and we sat in a small interview room with Detective Rasmussen for over 2 hours. He had a notebook and recorder and asked me to walk through every single incident with Brett starting from July. I told him about the weird comments and the touching and the late-night texts. I described the night he got into my bed and what he said about having a connection. The detective took detailed notes and asked specific questions about dates and times and exact words Brett used. He asked if I knew of any other women Brett might have behaved inappropriately toward. I said I didn't know of anyone, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were others. Detective Rasmussen said he'd be contacting Brett's workplace and previous employers to see if there were any complaints or incidents on record. He thanked me for being so thorough and brave in coming forward. He said the recordings were some of the clearest evidence he'd seen in a case like this. A week later, Detective Rasmussen called Rachel and asked her to come to the station. She went alone this time and came home looking pale and upset. She sat me down and told me what the detective had discovered. He'd contacted the bank where Brett supposedly still worked, and found out Brett had actually been fired 6 months ago. The HR department wouldn't give specific details, but confirmed his termination was related to complaints from female coworkers about uncomfortable behavior. Brett had never told Rachel he lost his job. He'd been leaving the house every morning like he was going to work, but Rachel had no idea where he was actually going or what he was doing all day. She felt sick realizing how much he'd been lying to her about everything. She kept saying she should have known something was wrong, that there must have been signs she missed. I reminded her that manipulative people are really good at hiding their true selves, and it wasn't her fault for trusting her husband, but she couldn't stop blaming herself for not protecting me sooner. The landlord called Rachel the next week saying her apartment repairs were finally finished and she could move back in. She'd been staying in our guest room since Brett left, but now she had to go back to the place she'd shared with him. We spent a Saturday moving her stuff back and helping her settle in. But that first night alone in the apartment, Rachel called me at midnight crying and hyperventilating. She said being in the space where she'd lived with Brett was making her panic. She kept thinking about all the times he'd left to supposedly go to work when he was really fired. She wondered if he'd been following me or watching me during those days. Every corner of the apartment reminded her of their life together and how it was all built on lies. I told her I'd come stay the night and drove over in my pajamas. We slept in her bed together like we used to when we were kids, and she was scared of thunderstorms. The next few nights she called with the same panic, and I started staying over every weekend to help her feel safer. We'd watch movies and talk until she fell asleep. During the week, she'd text me multiple times asking if I was okay and if I'd seen Brett anywhere. I knew I needed help processing everything that had happened, so Mom found me a therapist named Julie Norton, who specialized in family trauma. My first appointment was on a Thursday afternoon in her office downtown. Julie had a calm voice and a comfortable couch, and she asked me to tell her what brought me in. I explained the whole situation with Brett and how I felt guilty for destroying Rachel's marriage. Julie listened carefully, and when I finished, she said something that stuck with me. She told me Brett's actions destroyed the marriage, not my truth-telling. She said I'd actually protected both Rachel and myself by speaking up. She explained that keeping secrets to protect others often just allows harmful behavior to continue. We talked about how hard it must have been to carry that burden alone for months, and how brave it was to finally expose what was happening. By the end of the session, I felt a little lighter, like maybe I hadn't ruined everything after all. Julie said we'd work together on processing the trauma and rebuilding my sense of safety. I scheduled weekly appointments and left feeling like maybe I could actually get through this. 2 weeks after the restraining order was granted, Rachel called me from work in a panic. Brett had shown up at the hospital claiming he just wanted to talk to her. He tried to follow her into the building, but security stopped him at the entrance. Rachel was shaking and crying, and the security guards called the police. Uncle Rob happened to be on duty and responded to the call. He found Brett in the parking lot still trying to argue that he had a right to talk to his wife. Uncle Rob arrested him on the spot for violating the restraining order. Brett spent that night in jail and had to appear before a judge the next morning. The judge was not happy about the violation and increased the restraining order distance to 1,000 feet. She warned Brett that any future violations would result in serious jail time. Rachel felt safer knowing Brett had actually faced consequences for ignoring the order, but she was also more scared knowing he was willing to risk arrest just to get to her. Rachel had her first appointment with Julie the following week, and I waited in the lobby while they talked. When Rachel came out, her eyes were red and puffy, but she seemed calmer. In the car, she told me they'd spent the whole session talking about all the signs she'd missed with Brett. She said Julie helped her understand that people like Brett are skilled at manipulation and hiding their true nature. Julie explained that abusers often seem perfect at first, and slowly reveal their real selves once they feel secure in the relationship. Rachel said she'd been blaming herself for not seeing what Brett was doing to me, but Julie told her that was exactly what Brett wanted, for everyone to doubt themselves instead of holding him accountable. Rachel said it would take time, but she was starting to understand that none of this was her fault or mine. We were both victims of Brett's calculated behavior. 2 weeks after the birthday dinner confrontation, Detective Rasmussen called to say a woman had come forward with information about Brett. Her name was Claudius Baldwin, and she'd dated Brett 3 years ago before he met Rachel. Claudius said she'd seen Brett's name in the police records when she was at the station for an unrelated matter. She told the detective that Brett had exhibited similar behavior with her during their relationship. He'd pushed boundaries constantly, shown up at her workplace uninvited, and made her feel uncomfortable with inappropriate comments. She'd broken up with him because of it, but never filed a report because she thought it was just a bad relationship. Now knowing there were other victims, she wanted her experience documented. Detective Rasmussen said this was huge for the case because it established a clear pattern of behavior. Brett wasn't just some guy who made one mistake. He was someone who repeatedly targeted women and violated their boundaries. The detective said he'd be interviewing Claudius in detail and adding her statement to the investigation file. Interview with Claudius took 3 hours, and Detective Rasmussen documented everything she said about Brett's behavior during their relationship 3 years ago. She described how he'd shown up at her gym uninvited multiple times, how he'd send her long texts at 2 a.m. saying she was the only person who understood him, how he'd gotten angry when she tried to set boundaries. The detective thanked her for coming forward and said her testimony would be crucial in establishing Brett's pattern. 2 days later, Uncle Rob called to say Brett had another court appearance scheduled for the restraining order violation. Rachel and I went to the courthouse together, sitting in the back row while the judge reviewed the case. Brett's attorney argued that his client simply wanted to speak with his wife about their marriage and didn't realize approaching her at work violated the order. The prosecutor stood up and played the 911 call from the hospital security guard, where you could hear Brett yelling in the background that Rachel needed to stop being dramatic. The judge listened to the whole recording with her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at Brett and asked if he understood what a restraining order meant. Brett started to answer, but his attorney put a hand on his arm to stop him. The judge said this was Brett's second violation in less than a month, which showed a complete disregard for court orders and the safety of the protected parties. She said based on his repeated violations and the ongoing criminal investigation, she was revoking his bail completely. Brett would be held in county jail without bail until his criminal trial. Brett's face went white and he started arguing with his attorney, but 2 bailiffs came over and put handcuffs on him. Rachel grabbed my hand so hard it hurt, but I could feel her whole body relaxing next to me. The judge said Brett had demonstrated he was a danger to both Rachel and me, and the court couldn't trust him to follow any conditions of release. As they led Brett out of the courtroom, he turned around and stared at us. But for the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't scared. He was going to jail and couldn't get to us anymore. Walking out to the parking lot, Rachel started crying, but she was smiling at the same time. She kept saying she could finally breathe, that she didn't have to look over her shoulder constantly wondering if Brett would show up. Uncle Rob met us outside and said having Brett held without bail was the best possible outcome because it meant we had guaranteed safety until trial. Mom and Dad came over that night and we all sat in the living room talking about how different everything felt knowing Brett was locked up. The relief was so strong I actually slept through the whole night for the first time in weeks. The following Tuesday, I had my regular appointment with Julie and told her about the bail hearing and Brett being held in jail. She said it was completely normal to feel relief mixed with other complicated emotions, and we spent the session talking about the courtroom experience. I told her how Brett's attorney had tried to make it seem like his client just wanted to talk to his wife, completely ignoring the recordings and the pattern of harassment. Julie explained that defense attorneys often use victim-blaming tactics because they're trying to create doubt about the victim's credibility. She said it was a strategy that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with trying to win a case. Hearing her say that helped because I'd been worrying that maybe I had somehow caused Brett's behavior by not being clear enough about my boundaries. Julie reminded me that I'd told Brett no multiple times, that I'd physically pushed him out of my bed, that I'd recorded evidence because he wouldn't stop. She said predators like Brett deliberately ignore boundaries because they feel entitled to what they want, regardless of other people's feelings. We talked about how the trial would probably involve more of the same tactics, with Brett's attorney trying to discredit my testimony and suggest I wanted the attention or made things up. Julie gave me some techniques for staying calm under cross-examination, like taking deep breaths before answering questions and remembering that telling the truth was the most powerful thing I could do. She said victims often feel like they're on trial instead of the perpetrator, but the recordings and Claudius's testimony would make it clear that Brett had a pattern spanning years. By the end of the session, I felt more prepared for what was coming, even though the idea of testifying still made my stomach hurt. Rachel had been resistant when Julie first suggested she attend a support group for people leaving abusive relationships. She kept saying her situation was different, that Brett hadn't hit her or anything like that, so she didn't belong in a group for abuse victims. But Julie gently explained that abuse takes many forms beyond physical violence, and emotional manipulation and control are just as damaging. Rachel finally agreed to try one meeting just to see what it was like. The group met Thursday evenings at a community center downtown, and Rachel asked me to drive her there for her first session. I waited in the parking lot reading for my history class while she was inside for 2 hours. When she came out, her eyes were red, but she seemed lighter somehow. In the car, she told me about hearing other women's stories and realizing how many of Brett's behaviors fit patterns of emotional abuse. One woman talked about her ex always making her doubt her own perceptions, and Rachel said that's exactly what Brett had done when he claimed I was seducing him. Another woman described how her partner isolated her from friends by making subtle comments that caused drama, and Rachel remembered how Brett had discouraged her from spending time with her college friends because he said they were bad influences. She said hearing these stories from other women helped her see that what happened wasn't her fault, that Brett had been manipulating her from the beginning. The group facilitator had explained how abusers often seem perfect at first, love bombing their partners with gifts and attention, then slowly revealing controlling behaviors once the relationship feels secure. Rachel cried telling me this because it described her relationship with Brett exactly. She said she was going to keep attending the group because it helped her understand she wasn't alone, and she wasn't crazy for missing red flags that seemed obvious now. A week after Rachel's first support group meeting, she got a message on Facebook from Claudius asking if they could meet for coffee. Rachel showed me the message and asked what I thought. Claudius had written that she knew this was probably weird, but after talking to Detective Rasmussen about her own experiences with Brett, she felt like Rachel might understand what she'd been through. Rachel was nervous but agreed to meet her Saturday morning at a coffee shop near campus. I offered to go with her, but Rachel said she wanted to do this alone. She came home 3 hours later and immediately came to my room to tell me about it. She said Claudius was really nice, and they'd spent the whole time comparing notes about Brett's behavior. Claudius had dated him for 8 months before she finally broke things off because his boundary violations were getting worse. She told Rachel about how Brett would show up at her apartment where uninvited, how he'd go through her phone when she was in the bathroom, how he'd get angry if she talked to other guys even in completely innocent contexts. Claudius said she'd blamed herself for years, thinking she should have been clearer about what she wanted, but hearing about what Brett did to me made her realize he was the problem, not her. Rachel said it was incredibly healing to talk to someone who really understood what Brett was capable of, someone who didn't need explanations about how he could seem so perfect on the surface while being so disturbing underneath. They'd exchanged numbers and planned to meet again, and Claudius had even offered to help Rachel with anything she needed for the divorce or criminal case. Rachel said having this connection with someone who'd been through something similar made her feel less isolated and more confident that speaking up had been the right choice. 3 months passed with Brett in jail, and life started feeling almost normal again. I was catching up on schoolwork, Rachel was doing better at her nursing job, and our family was healing from the chaos. Then Detective Rasmussen called to say Brett's trial date had been officially set for 6 weeks from now. He wanted Claudius and me to come to the police station, so he could prepare us for testifying. We met him on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room with the prosecutor, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair who introduced herself and shook our hands. Detective Rasmussen explained that preparation was crucial because defense attorneys would try to confuse us or make us doubt our own memories. He said the key was to stay calm, answer only the question asked, and not elaborate unless specifically requested. The prosecutor added that Brett's attorney would likely try to suggest we had ulterior motives for accusing him, that we wanted attention, or were trying to cause problems in his marriage. She said the best response to these tactics was to stick to the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. We spent 2 hours going over potential cross-examination questions. Detective Rasmussen played the role of Brett's attorney, asking aggressive questions designed to rattle us. He asked me why I'd worn certain clothes around Brett if I didn't want his attention. He asked Claudius why she'd continued dating Brett for months if his behavior bothered her. He asked both of us why we'd waited so long to report anything. The prosecutor coached us on how to answer each type of question calmly and directly. She reminded us that hesitation or getting emotional didn't mean we were lying. It meant we were human beings discussing traumatic experiences. By the end of the session, I felt more prepared but also more anxious about the actual trial. Detective Rasmussen said that was normal, and we should call him anytime if we had questions or needed to practice more. The next week, the prosecutor asked Rachel, Claudius, and me to come to her office so she could review all the evidence and explain the specific charges Brett was facing. We sat around her conference table while she laid out folders containing transcripts of the recordings, witness statements from family members who'd been at the birthday dinner, and Claudius's detailed account of her relationship with Brett. She explained that Brett was charged with stalking, criminal harassment, and 2 counts of violating restraining orders. The stalking charge was based on his pattern of unwanted contact and showing up at places he knew we'd be. The harassment charges covered his inappropriate comments, unwanted touching, and getting into my bed. The restraining order violations were straightforward since there was clear documentation of him approaching Rachel at work and at the courthouse. The prosecutor said that with the recordings providing direct evidence of Brett's own words, the witness testimony from multiple people, and the established pattern across different victims over several years, she was confident about getting convictions on all counts. She explained that stalking and harassment could each carry sentences of up to 2 years, and the restraining order violations added additional time. She said realistically she expected Brett would get somewhere between 1 and 3 years in prison depending on the judge, plus probation and mandatory counseling after release. Rachel asked what would happen if Brett was found not guilty, and the prosecutor said honestly that was unlikely given the strength of evidence. But if it happened, we could still maintain the restraining orders and pursue civil cases. She said the most important thing was that we'd all been brave enough to come forward and document everything properly. Even if the legal system wasn't perfect, we'd done everything right and given the case the best possible chance of success. 2 weeks before the criminal trial, Benjamin called Rachel with news that her divorce was finalized. The judge had reviewed all the evidence and granted Rachel everything she'd requested, which was basically full separation of all assets and no alimony or ongoing contact required. Benjamin said the judge had specifically noted in the ruling that Brett's documented pattern of harassment and criminal charges made any kind of shared custody or ongoing relationship inappropriate. Rachel asked me to come with her to the courthouse to sign the final papers. We sat in a small office while Benjamin went over each document explaining what it meant. Rachel would keep her car, her personal belongings, and her half of their shared bank account. Brett got his car and his personal items, but that was it. The apartment lease had already been terminated due to the water damage, so there was no shared property to divide. When Rachel signed the last page, her hand was shaking and tears ran down her face. But when Benjamin congratulated her on being officially divorced, she smiled. In the car afterward, she told me these were relief tears, not sad tears. She said being legally free from Brett felt like a weight lifting off her chest that she hadn't even realized was there. For 2 years, she'd been Rachel Holcomb, and now she was Rachel Morgan again. She said it felt like getting herself back, like the person she'd been before Brett had slowly tried to reshape her into what he wanted. We went out for lunch to celebrate, and Rachel talked about her plans for the future. She wanted to take some time to focus on herself and her career before even thinking about dating again. She said Julie had helped her understand that she needed to rebuild her sense of self and learn to trust her instincts again before bringing someone new into her life. I told her I was proud of her for being so strong through everything, and she said she couldn't have done it without me speaking up at the birthday dinner. We both cried a little bit then, but they were good tears about surviving something terrible together. With the trial approaching, I forced myself to focus hard on catching up with all my schoolwork. The stress and fear from the past few months had really hurt my grades, but now that Brett was in jail and couldn't hurt us, I could actually concentrate on studying again. I met with each of my professors to explain what had been happening and ask about extra credit or makeup work. They were all incredibly understanding and supportive. My English professor said she'd heard about the case because her friend worked at the courthouse, and she told me she admired my courage. She gave me extensions on 2 papers and said I could resubmit my midterm essay for a better grade. My psychology professor offered to write me a letter of recommendation for law school applications, saying that what I'd been through and how I'd handled it showed exactly the kind of resilience and integrity the legal profession needed. My history professor let me do an independent study project to make up for missed assignments, and I chose to research the evolution of stalking laws in America, which felt weirdly relevant to my own situation. By the end of the semester, my grades had improved dramatically. I ended up with mostly B's and 1 A, which wasn't perfect, but was way better than the C's and D's I'd been getting during the worst of everything with Brett. Several professors mentioned in their feedback that they were impressed by how I'd overcome personal challenges to succeed academically. It felt good to have something positive to focus on besides the upcoming trial, and it reminded me that I had a whole life and future beyond this situation with Brett. 1 week before the trial was scheduled to start, the prosecutor called with unexpected news. Brett's attorney had offered a last-minute plea deal. If we agreed, Brett would plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for 18 months probation, mandatory counseling, and permanent restraining orders. He wouldn't serve any additional jail time beyond the 3 months he'd already been held without bail. The prosecutor explained that plea deals were common because trials were expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. She said the offer was probably being made because Brett's attorney knew the evidence against him was overwhelming, and a trial would likely result in prison time. But she wanted our input on whether to accept it, because we were the victims and our feelings mattered. She said if we proceeded to trial and won, Brett would definitely get prison time, maybe 1 to 3 years. But there was always a small chance a jury could be fooled by his attorney's tactics, and find him not guilty on some charges. The plea deal guaranteed a conviction and consequences, just not as severe as we might get from a trial. Rachel and I asked if we could have a few days to think about it and discuss it with our families. The prosecutor said we had until Friday to decide because jury selection was supposed to start Monday. That night, our whole family gathered at our house to talk about what to do. Mom said she wanted Brett to suffer as much as possible and thought we should go to trial. Dad agreed and said probation felt like letting Brett off easy. Aunt Linda pointed out that even with probation, Brett would have a criminal record and restraining orders, which would impact his life significantly. Uncle Rob said from his experience as a cop, plea deals often made sense because trials were unpredictable, and at least this way we'd get a guaranteed guilty plea. Rachel and I spent hours talking about the plea offer, weighing the guaranteed conviction against the possibility of getting Brett more serious prison time if we went to trial. We called Claudius to get her opinion since she'd be testifying too, and she said she'd support whatever we decided, but personally she wanted to go to trial. She said Brett had violated boundaries and ignored consequences his whole life, and probation felt like just another slap on the wrist that wouldn't actually change his behavior. Rachel agreed with that reasoning. She said if Brett got probation, he'd be out in the community in 18 months, free to target other women the same way he targeted Claudius and me. But if we went to trial and got him convicted on the full charges, he'd be in prison for years, and other women would be protected during that time. I thought about how scared I'd been when Brett was free on bail, how every unexpected noise made me jump, how I couldn't relax until I knew he was locked up. The idea of him being on probation in just over a year made my stomach hurt. We talked about the risk that a jury might not convict on all charges, but the prosecutor had said the evidence was really strong with the recordings and multiple victims. Finally, Rachel and I decided we wanted to proceed to trial. We called the prosecutor Friday morning and told her we wanted full charges and full consequences for Brett. She said she respected our decision and promised to fight as hard as possible to get convictions on everything. She reminded us that this meant we'd have to testify and face cross-examination, that it would be emotionally difficult, but she believed we were strong enough to handle it. Rachel said we'd already survived the worst of what Brett could do to us, and we weren't going to let him get away with reduced charges just because it was easier. The prosecutor said she'd notify Brett's attorney that the plea offer was rejected, and trial would proceed as scheduled. Uncle Rob said he was proud of us for choosing the harder path because it was the right thing to do. Mom made us promise to take care of ourselves emotionally over the next week while we prepared for trial, and we agreed to spend extra time with Julie getting ready for the courtroom experience. The week before trial moved slowly, each day feeling longer than the last as we prepared for what was coming. Julie met with Rachel and me together one afternoon to help us handle the stress of testifying, reminding us to breathe and focus on telling our truth without worrying about Brett's reactions. The prosecutor called me twice to review my testimony timeline and make sure I understood how the recordings would be presented as evidence. She explained that Brett's lawyer would try to confuse me or make me look unreliable, but staying calm and answering only what was asked would work in our favor. Detective Rasmussen stopped by the house on Thursday to check in and told us the courtroom would have security because Brett's family had made some threatening comments online about the trial being unfair. Mom got angry hearing that and said she wanted Brett's whole family banned from coming anywhere near us, but Rasmussen explained they had a right to attend unless they actually broke laws. Rachel barely slept that whole week, waking up multiple times each night from stress dreams about testifying. I heard her crying in her room one night and went to sit with her, and she admitted she was terrified of seeing Brett again, even though he'd be across the courtroom. We talked until almost dawn about how much our lives had changed since that birthday dinner, how speaking up had been horrible but necessary, and how we'd get through this trial the same way we'd gotten through everything else. The morning of December 3rd arrived freezing cold with gray clouds covering the whole sky. I woke up at 5 even though court didn't start until 9 because I couldn't sleep anymore. Rachel was already awake in the kitchen drinking coffee and staring at nothing, her hands shaking slightly when she lifted her mug. Mom made us eat breakfast even though neither of us wanted food, saying we needed energy for the long day ahead. Dad kept checking his watch and pacing around the living room, clearly nervous about seeing Brett again after months of him being locked up. We all got dressed in the clothes the prosecutor had suggested. Nothing too casual but nothing fancy either. Just normal outfits that made us look like regular people telling the truth. Uncle Rob picked us up at 7:30 to drive us downtown to the courthouse, and the whole car ride was silent except for the radio playing quietly. When we pulled into the parking garage, I felt my stomach twist into knots, knowing that in a few hours I'd be sitting on a witness stand describing everything Brett had done to me. The courthouse building was huge and old with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. Security checked our bags and made us walk through metal detectors before letting us go upstairs to the courtroom. The hallway outside was already filling with people, and I spotted Brett's parents standing near the water fountain looking angry and defensive. They glared at us when we walked past but didn't say anything because Uncle Rob was right there in his police uniform. Aunt Linda and my cousins showed up a few minutes later, along with some of Rachel's friends from the hospital who'd taken the day off work to support her. The prosecutor met us in a small conference room to go over last-minute details and remind us what to expect. She looked professional and confident in her dark suit, holding a thick folder of documents and evidence. She told me I'd be called first since I was the primary victim, and that my testimony would probably take most of the morning, because Brett's attorney would have lots of questions. Rachel would testify after lunch, and Claudius was scheduled for the next day to establish the pattern. The prosecutor said the recordings were our strongest evidence, and she'd play them multiple times to make sure the jury really heard what Brett had said. At 8:45, we walked into the courtroom itself, and I got my first look at where everything would happen. The room was smaller than I expected from TV shows, with wooden benches for observers and a raised area where the judge would sit. The jury box was empty, but would soon hold 12 people who'd decide Brett's fate. And there at the defense table sat Brett himself, wearing a suit that looked too big for him and looking down at his hands. My heart started racing seeing him again after all these months. He looked thinner than I remembered, his face pale and his hair shorter. When he glanced up and saw us entering, he quickly looked away, but I'd seen the flash of anger in his eyes. Rachel grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard, and I squeezed back to let her know I was okay. The bailiff told everyone to rise as the judge entered, an older woman with gray hair and glasses who looked stern but fair. She sat down and started explaining how the trial would proceed, talking about jury selection and opening statements. I tried to focus on her words but kept feeling Brett's presence across the room like a weight pressing on my chest. The jury selection took almost 2 hours, with both lawyers asking potential jurors questions about their views on harassment and whether they could be fair. Finally, 12 people were chosen, 7 women and 5 men of different ages and backgrounds. The prosecutor stood up to give her opening statement and laid out the entire case against Brett in clear, direct language. She described how he'd targeted me for months with inappropriate comments and unwanted touching, how he'd gotten into my bed claiming we had a connection, how he'd violated restraining orders multiple times. She explained that Claudius would testify about similar behavior years earlier, proving this was Brett's pattern, not a misunderstanding. She told the jury they'd hear recordings of Brett's own words describing what he wanted to do to me, recordings that couldn't be explained away or taken out of context. The defense attorney stood up next and tried to paint a different picture, suggesting I'd misinterpreted friendly behavior and that the recordings were edited or manipulated. He claimed Brett was a devoted husband whose sister-in-law had developed an inappropriate crush and then lied when rejected. Hearing him twist everything made me angry, but I kept my face neutral like Julie had taught me. After opening statements, the judge called a short recess before testimony would begin. I went to the bathroom with Rachel and Mom, my hands shaking as I washed them and stared at myself in the mirror. In 30 minutes, I'd be sitting in that witness chair telling strangers the most horrible details of what Brett had done. Rachel hugged me tight and reminded me I was strong enough to do this, that speaking my truth had already changed everything, and now I just had to do it one more time. When we returned to the courtroom, the prosecutor called my name, and I walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like rubber. The bailiff had me put my hand on a Bible and swear to tell the truth, and then I sat down in the chair facing the entire courtroom. The prosecutor started with basic questions about my age and relationship to Brett and Rachel, establishing the family connection. Then she asked me to describe the first time Brett made me uncomfortable, and I took a deep breath before starting to explain about the weird comments last July. I talked about how his behavior escalated over months, giving specific examples of things he'd said and done. The prosecutor showed me photos of text messages Brett had sent and asked me to read them out loud, including one where he'd called me beautiful at midnight, and another where he'd asked if I thought about him. Then she moved to the night he got into my bed, and I described every detail of that horrible moment. How I'd been doing homework when he walked in without knocking. How he'd climbed under my covers and tried to put his arm around me. Exactly what he'd said about Rachel not understanding him. My voice stayed steady, even though inside I was reliving the fear and violation of that night. The prosecutor asked if I'd told anyone immediately, and I explained my plan to gather evidence first, knowing no one would believe me without proof. Then came the recordings. The prosecutor played the first one, where Brett talked about my body, his voice filling the courtroom with disgusting comments about my appearance. I watched the jury's faces change as they listened, several looking disturbed or angry. She played the second recording where he asked if I ever thought about older men, his tone clearly inappropriate and suggestive. Then the third where he described what he wanted to do to me, details so specific and gross that 2 jury members actually winced. After each recording, the prosecutor asked me to confirm when and where it was made, and I provided exact dates and locations. She asked how making these recordings made me feel, and I said scared but determined, knowing I needed proof to protect myself and potentially other women. The prosecutor's questioning lasted almost 2 hours before she said she had no further questions. The judge called for a lunch break and told me I'd be cross-examined by the defense attorney when we returned. I stepped down from the witness stand feeling drained but relieved to have gotten through the first part. Rachel hugged me in the hallway and said I'd done amazing, that my testimony was clear and powerful. We ate lunch in the conference room, but I could barely taste the sandwich Mom had brought, too nervous about facing Brett's attorney. Uncle Rob reminded me that the lawyer's job was to defend Brett no matter what, so I shouldn't take his questions personally. At 1 o'clock, we returned to the courtroom and I went back to the witness stand. Brett's attorney stood up and approached with a fake friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. He started by asking if I'd ever had romantic feelings for Brett, and I said absolutely not. He asked if I was jealous of Rachel's marriage, and I said no, I was happy for my sister. He suggested I'd dressed provocatively around the house to get Brett's attention, and I explained I wore normal pajamas and comfortable clothes like anyone would in their own home. He tried to imply the recordings were edited, but I explained they were continuous files with timestamps that couldn't be faked. He asked why I hadn't told my parents immediately after Brett got in my bed, and I said I was scared and needed evidence first. He kept trying to twist my words or catch me in contradictions, but I stayed calm and consistent, answering only what was asked without getting defensive. After an hour of his questions, I could see he wasn't making progress, that my story held up under pressure. Finally, he said he had no more questions, and I was dismissed. Walking back to my seat felt like floating, relief washing over me that the worst part was over. The prosecutor called Rachel next, and she took the stand looking nervous but determined. She testified about the emotional devastation of learning her husband had been pursuing her little sister for months. She described their marriage and how Brett had seemed perfect at first, attentive and loving. Then she explained finding texts on his phone where he complained about her to friends, calling her boring and saying he was more attracted to me. She talked about the night of the birthday dinner when everything came out, how hearing those recordings destroyed her world in seconds. The prosecutor asked about Brett's behavior after being confronted, and Rachel described his attempts to manipulate her through texts, blaming me and claiming everything was misunderstood. She explained filing for divorce and restraining orders and how Brett had violated those orders by showing up at her workplace. Her voice broke several times during testimony, but she kept going, determined to make the jury understand the full scope of Brett's manipulation. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, he tried to suggest their marriage had problems before I came into the picture, but Rachel firmly stated everything was fine until she discovered Brett's predatory behavior toward me. After Rachel finished testifying, the judge said we'd continue tomorrow with Claudius's testimony, and court was dismissed for the day. Walking out of the courthouse that evening, I felt exhausted but hopeful. The jury had heard the truth and seen the evidence. Now we just had to wait and see if justice would actually be served. The judge banged her gavel one final time and court was dismissed. Rachel grabbed my hand tight as we stood up and walked toward the exit together. Outside the courthouse steps, the February air felt cold but clean somehow. Rachel pulled me into a hug and we both started crying, but it was different this time. These weren't tears of fear or anger anymore. They were tears of relief that the nightmare was actually over. Mom and Dad caught up to us and wrapped their arms around both of us. Uncle Rob stood nearby looking satisfied that justice had been served. We drove home together as a family and ordered pizza for dinner. Nobody felt like celebrating loudly, but there was this quiet sense of peace in the house. Dad raised his glass of water and said he was proud of us for being so brave through everything. Mom reminded us that healing would take time, and we shouldn't expect everything to feel normal right away. Rachel and I stayed up late that night talking about what came next for both of us. When spring semester started in January, I walked onto campus feeling lighter than I had in months. The constant worry about Brett showing up somewhere or violating the restraining order was finally gone. I could focus on my classes without checking over my shoulder every few minutes. My biology professor noticed I was more engaged during lectures, and my grades started climbing back up. I joined study groups without feeling anxious about being around people. The experience with Brett had changed something fundamental in me. I paid more attention to how people acted around me now. When a guy in my chemistry class kept texting me after I said I wasn't interested, I blocked him immediately instead of worrying about being rude. I spoke up in class more often and stopped apologizing for taking up space. My roommate commented that I seemed more confident and sure of myself. I still had bad days where the memories would hit me hard, but they were getting further apart. I started recognizing the warning signs of manipulative behavior that I'd missed before with Brett. A friend complained about her boyfriend showing up at her dorm unannounced, and I helped her see that wasn't romantic, it was controlling. I wasn't going to let what happened to me happen to someone else if I could help it. Rachel started seeing Julie regularly for therapy sessions focused on rebuilding her ability to trust people. Julie encouraged her to take things slow with dating and listen to her gut instincts. By March, Rachel mentioned she'd gone on a coffee date with someone from the hospital but kept it casual. She told me she wasn't rushing into anything serious because she needed to focus on herself first. Her nursing career became her main priority, and she threw herself into her work. She picked up extra shifts and volunteered for training programs. She was building a new life that had nothing to do with Brett or the person she'd been when she was married to him. She started going to a book club with some coworkers and made new friends who didn't know anything about what had happened. Rachel said it felt good to be around people who saw her as just Rachel the nurse, not Rachel the victim. She was careful about who she let into her life now. When guys at the hospital asked her out, she politely declined most of them. She told me she could spot red flags from a mile away now, the way someone talked about their ex or treated waitstaff or reacted when she said no to something small. She wasn't going to ignore those signs ever again. Claudius and I met for coffee in April at a place halfway between our towns. She looked healthier than when I'd first met her during the trial. We talked about how we were both doing, and she thanked me again for coming forward. She said knowing Brett was in prison gave her closure she didn't think she'd ever get. We talked about the guilt we both felt sometimes, wondering if we should have reported him sooner. But we reminded each other that we'd done the best we could with the information and resources we had at the time. Claudius mentioned she was seeing someone new who treated her with respect and patience. She was taking things really slow and being honest about her past trauma. We promised to check in with each other every few months. It helped having someone who understood exactly what it was like to deal with Brett's manipulation. We didn't have to explain ourselves or justify our reactions. We just got it. Before we left, Claudius said she hoped our testimonies would protect other women from going through what we did. I told her I thought they already had. 6 months after the trial in June, I was thriving in ways I hadn't expected. My spring semester grades were the best I'd had since starting college. I joined a campus organization called Students Against Sexual Harassment that provided resources and support for survivors. I started sharing my story at their meetings and helping other students recognize warning signs of predatory behavior. A freshman told me after one meeting that my story helped her realize her boyfriend's jealousy and controlling texts weren't normal. She broke up with him and thanked me for giving her the courage to trust her instincts. I volunteered to be a peer counselor for students who wanted to report harassment but didn't know how to navigate the system. The work was hard emotionally, but it felt meaningful. I was taking something terrible that happened to me and using it to help other people. My social life improved too because I wasn't constantly anxious and withdrawn anymore. I went to parties and actually had fun instead of worrying about who might be watching me. I dated casually without the fear that had held me back before. I knew what healthy boundaries looked like now, and I wasn't afraid to enforce them. Rachel called me in July with exciting news. She'd been promoted to charge nurse at the hospital, a position she'd been working toward for over a year. Her supervisor told her during the review that her grace under pressure and resilience made her perfect for the leadership role. Rachel cried happy tears when she told me because she'd worried that everything with Brett would hold her back professionally. Instead, it had shown her supervisors how strong she really was. The promotion came with better pay and more responsibility. She'd be managing a whole team of nurses and coordinating patient care. Rachel said it felt like proof that she was moving forward with her life. She wasn't defined by what Brett had done to her. She was building something new and better. She invited me and our parents out to dinner to celebrate. Watching her smile and laugh without that haunted look in her eyes made me realize how far we'd both come. She was genuinely happy again in a way I hadn't seen since before she married Brett. I got a letter from the prosecutor's office in August that made my stomach drop at first. Then I read it and felt this wave of satisfaction. Brett had violated his probation by trying to contact another woman inappropriately through social media. The woman reported it immediately, and now Brett was going back to jail to serve additional time. The prosecutor said this showed the court had been right to take his pattern of behavior seriously. Knowing the system was holding him accountable even after sentencing brought me real peace of mind. He couldn't just serve his time and go right back to harassing women. There were consequences that actually stuck. I showed the letter to Rachel, and she looked relieved too. We'd both worried a little that Brett would get out eventually and try to contact us or someone else. But this proved that people were watching him, and he couldn't get away with it anymore. The prosecutor thanked us again for our testimony and said cases like ours helped protect the whole community. Rachel texted me in September asking if I wanted to take a sister trip to the beach. She said it would have been her second wedding anniversary with Brett, and she wanted to celebrate her freedom instead. I immediately said yes, and we booked a long weekend at a small beach town 3 hours away. We spent our days walking on the beach, eating seafood, and talking about the future. Rachel told me about the guy she'd been seeing from the hospital named Thomas. She said he was patient and kind and didn't push her for more than she was ready to give. I told her about my plans to apply for law school after graduation. I wanted to become a prosecutor like the woman who'd fought for us. We laughed until our stomachs hurt and took silly pictures and just relaxed without any fear hanging over us. On our last night there, we sat on the beach watching the sunset. Rachel said she was grateful that speaking up had saved both of us from years more of Brett's manipulation. I told her I was grateful she'd believed me and supported me through everything. We toasted with our drinks to new beginnings and second chances. When we got home from the beach trip, Mom and Dad sat us down for a family talk. Dad looked uncomfortable but determined. He said he was proud of our strength and courage through everything, but he needed to say something that had been bothering him. He admitted he struggled with guilt for not seeing Brett's behavior sooner. He kept replaying moments in his head wondering if he'd missed signs or ignored red flags. Rachel and I both jumped in to reassure him. We explained that Brett was skilled at hiding his true nature from everyone. He'd fooled Rachel completely, and she'd been married to him. He'd fooled Mom and Aunt Linda and Uncle Rob, who was literally trained to spot criminals. Dad couldn't have known because Brett was careful to only show his real self when no one else was watching. Mom added that predators like Brett are manipulative by nature, and blaming ourselves for not catching them sooner just gives them more power. We spent an hour talking through everyone's feelings and guilt. By the end, Dad seemed lighter, like he'd been carrying this weight and finally put it down. I had a therapy session with Julie in October where we talked about my remaining anxiety and trust issues. Julie said I'd made incredible progress in feeling safe and confident again. The panic attacks had stopped and I wasn't constantly checking over my shoulder anymore. But I still had moments where I'd freeze up if a guy touched my shoulder unexpectedly or stood too close. Julie reminded me that healing isn't a straight line. There would be good days and setbacks, and that was completely normal after trauma. She helped me develop coping strategies for when those moments hit. We practiced breathing exercises and grounding techniques. She also encouraged me to keep sharing my story in safe spaces because helping others was clearly part of my healing process. I told her about my law school plans, and she said she thought I'd make an excellent advocate for survivors. When I left her office that day, I felt genuinely proud of how far I'd come. I wasn't the scared girl who'd hidden in her room anymore. I was someone who'd stood up for herself and helped put a predator in prison. That was something to be proud of. Around April, Rachel mentioned a guy named Thomas she'd met through her coworkers at the hospital during a group dinner. She brought him up casually while we were folding laundry at her apartment, saying he seemed nice and had invited her to coffee. I asked if she was ready to date again, and she shrugged, admitting she was nervous but also tired of letting Brett steal any more of her life. Thomas worked as a physical therapist at a sports medicine clinic, and apparently made Rachel laugh when they talked about their worst patient stories. She went to coffee with him twice before telling me about it, which showed how careful she was being this time. When she finally introduced him to the family at a casual barbecue in May, Thomas was quiet and polite, asking genuine questions about everyone's lives instead of trying too hard to impress. He held doors, listened when Rachel spoke, and didn't push for physical contact beyond a brief hand on her back. Dad pulled me aside after dinner and said Thomas seemed like a good guy, and I agreed. Rachel took things incredibly slowly with him, setting clear boundaries about her past and what she needed in terms of patience and respect. Thomas never pressured her or made jokes about her caution. By summer, they were officially dating, but Rachel still maintained her own space and independence, which Julie said was a healthy sign of her growth. I spent most of spring semester meeting with my academic advisor to plan out my path to law school. The LSAT prep courses were brutal, but I kept thinking about the prosecutor who'd fought for us in court, and Detective Rasmussen who'd taken my case seriously from day one. I wanted to be that person for other victims, someone who actually listened and believed them and fought to hold predators accountable. My advisor helped me identify schools with strong programs in victim advocacy and criminal justice. I started volunteering at a legal aid clinic on campus, helping survivors of harassment file reports and navigate the system. The work was emotionally heavy, but also deeply satisfying because I understood exactly what these people were going through. I wrote my law school application essay about my experience with Brett, and how it showed me the power of speaking up and having people in your corner who refused to let predators win. My professors who knew my story wrote strong recommendation letters emphasizing my resilience and commitment to justice. By the end of summer, I'd submitted applications to 6 schools and felt genuinely excited about my future, instead of scared. When October rolled around and Mom's birthday came up again, the difference from last year was startling. We had the same family dinner set up with everyone gathered around the table, but this time there was no tension, no watching someone's hands or worrying about inappropriate comments. Rachel brought Thomas and he fit naturally into our family chaos, helping carry dishes and joking with my cousins. Rachel looked genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since before she married Brett, laughing freely and leaning into Thomas without any fear in her eyes. I'd just gotten my first law school acceptance letter that morning and announced it at dinner, which led to champagne toasts and Dad getting teary while saying how proud he was. Uncle Rob joked that the family now had 2 people in law enforcement between him and my future career. Aunt Linda hugged me tight and whispered that I was going to help so many people. We ate cake and played board games and stayed up late talking, and nobody had to walk on eggshells or pretend everything was fine. The atmosphere was light and safe and full of actual joy instead of the forced happiness we'd all tried to maintain when Brett was poisoning everything. Sitting there watching my family laugh and celebrate, I thought about that night a year ago when I'd stood up and played those recordings. It had been the scariest moment of my life, knowing I was about to blow up Rachel's marriage and potentially destroy our family. But staying silent would have been worse, letting Brett continue his manipulation and abuse while I suffered in silence. Speaking up had been terrifying but absolutely necessary, and it had saved both Rachel and me from years more of his toxic presence. Rachel was building an amazing new life with someone who actually respected her, and I was heading toward a career helping other survivors find their voices. We'd both come through hell and come out stronger on the other side. We protected each other and ourselves, and that was something to be genuinely proud of.